This is Still Unanswered. I'm Maya Ellison. July 1979, Southwest Atlanta. Kids in the street, porch lights on, a city of cranes and construction and long shadows. 4 days apart, 2 boys disappear. 4 days later, their bodies are found in a wooded area. 2 names: Edward Hope Teddy Smith, 14, and Alfred Q. Evans, 13. Those 2 deaths would later be folded into a single, terrifying story, what the city would call the Atlanta Child Murders. Tonight, we go back through that story, the fear, the investigation, the evidence, and the families who say the truth is still unanswered. With me is Dr. Calvin Rhodes, criminologist and legal historian. Calvin, you know Atlanta. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Maya. It's good to be here. It's heavy work, these cases, and we've both carried this history in different ways for years.
Yeah. Before we dive into the case itself, I want to, just for listeners, set the city scene. Atlanta, in the late 1970s, liked to call itself the city too busy to hate. There was a black mayor, Maynard Jackson, a growing black middle class, big corporate investments. At the same time, miles of highway projects had cut through black neighborhoods. Freeways, redevelopment, displacement. You can almost map the victims onto that geography. Calvin, how should listeners understand that background? Why does it matter?
It matters because violence doesn't occur in a vacuum. Atlanta's growth in that era had 2 faces: the downtown corporate narrative and the lived reality of many black neighborhoods. Infrastructure projects pushed people aside. Many of the children who disappeared lived in neighborhoods the city treated as expendable, marginalized zones near expressways and the Chattahoochee. That geography, not just coincidence, affected how quickly police reacted, how the media covered the stories, and how families perceived the response. Race, class, and urban planning all shaped the investigation from the start.
Right. And that early under-response is one of the threads that runs through everything. Families said reports were dismissed as runaways or neighborhood drama. Meanwhile, more kids went missing.
Exactly. In the fall of 1979, cases were still treated as isolated. But as disappearances grew, Milton Harvey, Yusuf Bell, and others, people in communities began to notice patterns. The local black press started raising alarms before the national media caught on. That's important. This was community knowledge before it was institutionalized knowledge.
I want to name a few of the victims now, because part of what we're trying to do here is keep them distinct, keep them human. Yusuf Bell was 9. He was sent to a store to buy snuff and never came back. A witness said she saw him get into a blue car. Luby Geeter was 14. He ran errands, helped neighbors. Patrick Rogers was 16, found in the Chattahoochee. Darren Glass, 10, never recovered. Listeners, these were kids who did ordinary things. They were loved.
And their families remember them that way. Reverend John Bell Yusuf's stepfather became a public voice for remembrance and justice. He led vigils. Parents organized patrols. Churches pulled neighborhoods together. The grief, Maya, it was communal and prolonged. Parents kept kids inside for months. There were curfews, neighborhood security squads. People learned to watch each other in ways they hadn't before.
There's an image I keep going back to when I read those accounts. Parents walking kids to school, holding hands, refusing to let them out of sight. And the city, politically, was in a bind. Maynard Jackson had to balance protecting citizens with protecting Atlanta's image as a progressive city that could do business. Some historians argue that urgency to keep investment flowing colored the official response. What's your take?
It's complicated. Jackson's administration was under enormous pressure. Business leaders and tourism interests were anxious. At the same time, Jackson, an African-American mayor in the South during that period, was navigating race politics and federal relationships. There were accusations that city leaders downplayed the crisis early on, but there's also evidence the mayor later pushed for federal assistance, and ultimately the FBI was brought in. The politics did shape timing and optics, though whether it shaped investigative facts, that's a harder causal claim. Still, perception matters. Many families felt ignored, and that set the tone for decades of distrust.
Which brings us to the task force. As bodies continued to surface, the city formed a multi-agency task force, the FBI's ATKID operation, local and state detectives. At its peak, over 100 law enforcement personnel were assigned. The FBI brought in profiling expertise. John Douglas produced a profile suggesting a young black man. That profiling decision would become one of the most contested pieces of the puzzle. Calvin, why did the FBI settle on that profile, and how did it shape the inquiry?
Profiling in the late 1970s and early 1980s was an emerging science. John Douglas and others were trying to interpret patterns, dump sites, victim demographics, timing. They concluded the killer likely knew the neighborhoods, could approach kids without immediate suspicion, and was comfortable near riverbanks and expressways. The profile leaned toward a black male offender, partly because of victim demographics and likely offender access. But, and this is crucial, profiling is probabilistic, not definitive. It narrowed the investigative lens. If you tell investigators you're looking for a black suspect who fits a certain profile, that affects who you interview, who you surveil, and ultimately who becomes a suspect. And that has long-term consequences when the wrong person, or the right person, but only for some killings, is targeted.
And then the river. By early 1981, many bodies were found in or near the Chattahoochee. Investigators began a stakeout of bridges, looking for someone dumping bodies. May 22, 1981, the night the stakeout heard a splash. Officers saw a white 1970 Chevrolet station wagon cross and recross a bridge. They stopped the car. The driver was Wayne Williams. He was 23, a music promoter and freelance photographer. They questioned him and, this is hard to hear, let him go that night. 2 days later, Nathaniel Cater's body was pulled from the river. That chain of events becomes the hinge of the whole case.
People remember the splash. It's almost cinematic. The officers did what they could under the rules of probable cause at the time. Without a body, without clear evidence, they couldn't hold him. 2 days later, with a body downstream from their stakeout, plus polygraph failures, and then increasingly intense forensic work, hair and fiber analysis, the case turned toward Williams.
Let's get into the forensics, because it's central, and it's also where a lot of uncertainty creeps in. The state's case relied heavily on fiber and hair comparisons. Green nylon carpet fibers found on victims allegedly matched Williams' parents' home. Bedspread fibers, car upholstery fibers, dog hairs from a German shepherd, these were presented as linking Williams to multiple victims. At trial, experts told jurors these matches were compelling. Calvin, explain how that kind of evidence was treated then and how scientific understanding has changed.
In the early 1980s, trace evidence, micro-comparison of hairs and fibers, was cutting-edge and persuasive to juries. Analysts would examine color, diameter, chemical composition under microscopes, and sometimes with chemical tests. They made comparative judgments. These fibers are consistent with fibers from X. But they often lacked statistical frameworks that could tell you how rare a match really was. In recent decades, the FBI has acknowledged that some hair comparison testimony overstated certainty in many cases. The methods themselves weren't fraudulent, they were limited, and analysts sometimes presented conclusions with more confidence than the science warranted. In Williams' case, decades later, that retrospective critique raises real questions about how strongly we can rely on those fiber matches.
So the prosecution's argument was, multiple victims had fibers consistent with items in Williams' environment, so he must be the killer. But critics point to possible confirmation bias. Once he became a suspect, investigators may have focused on items that supported that narrative. There were also chain of custody concerns and the sheer complexity of evidence handled by multiple agencies. Did the defense at trial push back on those things?
They did. The defense argued contamination, alternative explanations, and the possibility of multiple perpetrators. They sought to weaken the forensic certainty. But the jury heard not only the forensic testimony, but also witness statements linking Williams to certain victims. People saying they'd seen him with Luby Geter, for instance, and other circumstantial threads. The cumulative effect persuaded jurors in 1982 to convict him on the murders of Catter and Payne.
He was convicted for 2 adult murders, not the children. The state then administratively closed or attributed many of the child murders to Williams. Some say at least 20 of the 29. That decision has been a flashpoint for families and critics ever since. Why try him only for 2 murders if you thought he killed so many more?
There are practical and strategic reasons prosecutors often do that. They charge the cases they thought were strongest, where forensic evidence and witness testimony were the clearest. Try one strong case, get a conviction and a life sentence, and you avoid costly death penalty litigation or multiple trials. But that leaves the families of the children in a liminal space. The state effectively said the case is closed, even though many of those killings weren't proven in court. For families who demanded trials and public scrutiny, that administrative closure felt unsatisfying, like a verdict handed down without full accounting.
I want to pause here and bring the families back into the frame. Calvin, you and I have both spoken to mothers and fathers who said, bluntly, Wayne Williams didn't kill their child. They point to differences in method, to lack of eyewitnesses, to alternative leads. Some even point to Klan involvement. These aren't conspiracy theories. Some leads involved informants and names that were, at times, reportedly downplayed. How do we balance the prosecution's conviction with genuine family skepticism?
Balance requires humility. We have to hold both truths. Law enforcement secured a conviction, and many markers, the spike in killings stopping after Williams' arrest, the forensic testimony at trial, support the claim he was involved in at least some murders. Simultaneously, family skepticism is legitimate. They saw dead ends, perceived indifference, and evidence that was either not tested or not fully explained. There were Klan-related leads that, according to some sources, weren't pushed as hard as they might have been because of political fear. Even if those leads weren't productive, the fact that they existed and were treated inconsistently matters. Families deserve transparency about what was followed and why.
Let's talk about the stopping of the murders. That's always been a powerful circumstantial sign for the prosecution. Murders that fit the pattern stopped after Williams' arrest. But critics say correlation isn't causation. Maybe the killer moved. Maybe other suspects were arrested in unrelated matters. Or maybe the authorities changed patrol patterns. Calvin, how convincing is the stopped after arrest argument?
It's strong, but not conclusive. Serial offenders sometimes stop because they're incarcerated, die, move, or simply stop. Law enforcement will always point to cessation as corroborative. But in a city with many overlapping criminal dynamics, gang violence, seasonal fluctuations, policing changes, you can't rely solely on cessation as proof. It strengthens a circumstantial case, but should be weighed alongside forensic, witness, and investigative records.
I want to name one more forensic detail listeners should hear. Charles Stevens, a 12-year-old found in October 1980, had dog hairs and Caucasian head hairs recovered on his body, hairs that did not match him or Wayne Williams. That's one of the puzzling pieces that feeds the multiple killer theory. Calvin, are there other specific anomalies you point to when assessing the idea of multiple killers?
Victim profile variance is a key one. The ages ranged 9 to late 20s. Methods varied: strangulation, bludgeoning, occasionally gunshot, and dump sites were spread across different neighborhoods. Some murders involved signs of sexual assault, others did not. In some cases, victims had ties to drugs or criminals, suggesting motive. Those differences can mean one predator with evolving methods or multiple perpetrators. Statistically, clusters with wide variance should lead investigators to consider multiple hypotheses, not just convergence on a single suspect.
We need to discuss James Baldwin. He wrote about the case in The Evidence of Things Not Seen, and he used the murders to talk about what American society did to Black communities, how neglect and structural violence created spaces where children were vulnerable. He didn't just ask who killed them, he asked what killed them. That framing changes the conversation from only whodunit to really, why were these kids exposed? It's an angrier, literary kind of truth.
Baldwin's point is essential. Investigative work focuses on individuals, and it must, because someone may have committed murder. But Baldwin pushes us to examine institutional neglect, poverty, zoning, inadequate policing, broken social services. Those are causal factors that make certain populations vulnerable. Remember, when people talk about who matters in media coverage, Baldwin's critique remains current. These were kids from marginalized neighborhoods. Their disappearances didn't immediately trigger national outrage the way other cases might. That, too, is part of what we're still answering.
And then, years and decades later, science changes. In 2019, Atlanta officials announced a formal review. Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms and Police Chief Erica Shields said they would re-examine evidence with modern DNA techniques. Some materials were sent to labs that can test highly degraded samples. Families hoped for answers. Williams said he would cooperate. Calvin, what can modern forensics realistically do here?
Modern DNA analysis has advanced enormously. Mitochondrial DNA testing, YSTR analysis, massively parallel sequencing can sometimes get profiles from hair roots or degraded biological material that would have been unusable in 1982. But two big caveats. A. Preservation. Evidence stored for decades may be degraded or contaminated. And B. Associated material. What exactly was preserved? If you have hairs without roots, you might get mitochondrial DNA that can exclude but often not uniquely identify a source. And contamination risk after decades in storage is real. So modern forensics can clarify in some cases, exonerate in others, but it's not a guaranteed answer to all questions.
And that's what's hard for families. Hope for answers, but often ambiguous or inconclusive results. Reports over the last several years have trickled out, some testing completed, some claimed not conclusive. Families have pressed for full transparency on results. There's also the legal side, Williams' appeals and habeas petitions that argued ineffective counsel, flawed fiber testimony, and withheld leads. Georgia courts have generally denied new trials. In 2006, a federal judge rejected Williams' request. He remains incarcerated. Any chance those legal doors reopen?
Legally, it's an uphill battle. Courts give considerable deference to state court findings unless there's new, material evidence that would likely have changed the outcome. If modern testing were to show exculpatory DNA on key items that belong to someone else, that could be material. But evidence would need to be credible, replicable, and significant enough to undermine the original conviction. Courts have not yet seen that standard met in this case. That said, science evolves, and so do standards. So, theoretically, yes, but practically it requires something substantial.
Let's talk about something listeners often ask. Was Wayne Williams publicly presented as the one man responsible for nearly 30 murders because that made Atlanta's problem seem solved? There's a rhetorical danger here, an impulse to find a person to personify fear. Tell me straight, how much do you think civic image pushed the narrative toward Williams?
There's no single motive. Political pressure to reestablish order almost always plays into high-profile investigations. Having an identifiable suspect who plausibly could be the perpetrator allows a city to say, the danger is over. Whether that drove investigators to ignore other leads is an empirical question. There's evidence some leads, especially those implicating white supremacists, weren't pursued with the same vigor in early stages. Whether that was because of preservation of city image, institutional bias, or investigative judgment, or a mix, is still debated. The fundamental point, the social desire for closure, can shape investigative choices, sometimes prematurely.
I'm going to read a short quote from Rev. John Bell at the 2023 memorial dedication, The Atlanta Children's Eternal Flame. He said, "This is a really beautiful event. To keep this out front because this same thing can happen again. Community awareness will make it very hard for this to happen again." Calvin, after all these decades, how does the memorialization interact with the need for continued investigation?
Memorials are about memory and recognition, acknowledging loss, centering victims. They don't replace investigations, but they are part of civic duty, honoring lives and signaling that the community remembers. For families who never got trials or full answers, memorials can be bittersweet, gratitude for remembrance and frustration that questions remain. Ideally, memorialization and ongoing forensic review proceed together. One honors the dead, the other seeks justice for the living.
Some families have accepted the memorial, but still demand transparency, full disclosure of testing and results. That demand for openness is a theme for our series. I want to give listeners a sense, again, of the unresolved questions we keep coming back to. 1. Can we trust the science of yesterday? 2. Was there, in fact, one killer or several? 3. Did politics and the city's image accelerate closure? 4. What would meaningful closure look like for families now? Calvin, any other questions we need to keep on the table?
I'd add, what standards do we set for revisiting old cases? And how transparent should law enforcement be about negative or inconclusive results? Also, how do we center families in processes that have historically sidelined them? Those are procedural but moral questions. How a modern city reconciles with past injustice.
Let's slow down and tell a few short human stories, because the names should matter beyond the arguments. I spoke with June Thompson, sister of Darren Glass, who said, "It goes to show that they are never forgotten. Their memories are always alive in our hearts." And Rev. John Bell, Yusuf's stepfather, said the memorial keeps the conversation going. These are not abstract crimes to people. They're sons, nephews, friends.
Yes. Also consider the families who say Williams didn't kill their children. People like Catherine Leach, mother of Curtis Walker. She and others have been vocal. They want further investigation. Whether or not Williams was involved, the family's pain remains. Any narrative that erases their doubt or their need for answers is incomplete.
I want to take a listener question now. Someone asked on our social page, if forensic tests come back inconclusive, does that satisfy anyone? Simple question, big answer.
Inconclusive results rarely satisfy. They often prolong grief because they don't provide resolution. But inconclusive results are still informative. They're data points. They can guide whether to keep searching, to look at alternative leads, or to acknowledge limits in what science can say after decades. For many families, though, the emotional closure comes from being heard, from official transparency, and sometimes from public acknowledgement of mistakes.
That transparency piece, so often absent, is one of the reasons we called the podcast Still Unanswered. We try to push institutions to answer what they can and to admit what they can't. Before we wrap, Calvin, I want to ask, if a listener takes away one thing tonight about the Atlanta child murders, what should it be?
Don't settle for easy narratives. And, critically, remember the victims as people. The case shows that justice is not just about identifying an individual, but confronting the social conditions that made these tragedies possible. Keep asking for transparency and listen to the families. They often hold key memories and priorities that formal processes overlook.
Powerful. Okay, closing act. We'll return to that May 22nd stakeout for a moment. The splash, the car, the stop, the release, the body found 2 days later, Nathaniel Cater. Wayne Williams arrested in June 1981, convicted of 2 murders in 1982, sentenced to consecutive life terms. The state officially attributes many of the other deaths to him administratively. Families, activists, and scholars continue to ask, did we get it right? Today, the city has a memorial, the Atlanta Children's Eternal Flame, dedicated in 2023. In 2019, a new forensic review began. Some testing has been done, some questions remain. Still unanswered.
And that phrasing, still unanswered, is the honest posture. The case sits at the intersection of evolving science, troubled policing, race and politics, and the pain of families. We've got work to do, historically, legally, and morally, to keep that honest engagement alive.
We'll link to archival resources, timelines, and further reading. James Baldwin's The Evidence of Things Not Seen, the FBI retrospective, and reporting on the 2019 review in the episode notes. If you're a family member listening and you want to reach out, we'll include contact info for local support groups and advocacy organizations. Calvin, thank you. This is heavy stuff, and you handled it with care.
Thank you, Maya. And thank you to the families and community members who continue to share their stories. That memory work matters.
One last thing before we go. I want to read the names again, slowly, not like a list, but as an act of remembering. Edward Hope Teddy Smith, Alfred Q. Evans, Milton Harvey, Yusuf Bell, Angel Lenair, Jeffrey Mathis, Anthony Carter, Earl Terrell, Clifford Jones, Darren Glass, Charles Stevens, Aaron Jackson, Patrick Rogers, Luby Geeter, Terry Pugh, Eddie Duncan, Larry Rogers, John Porter, Jimmy Ray Payne, William Billy Starr Barrett, Nathaniel Cater, and others. They were children, teens, young men. They deserve that voice, every one of them. This is Still Unanswered. I'm Maya Ellison. Thank you for listening.
Good night.
This episode was produced by Still Unanswered. Research credits, archival materials from public reporting, court records, and interviews. If you found this episode meaningful, please consider supporting our work. Subscribe, share, and tell someone whose history you think should be remembered. Until next time, stay curious and keep asking the hard questions.